It's got to improve what we find and leave something better behind than what we found. And that's where I start to advocate for something that we term good governance. I call it better governance on behalf of the UBP. That's a very, most time people start, their eyes glaze over, they're getting ready to sleep when I start talking about that. And because we start talking about the need for better accountability, greater transparency. And for what purpose? This is a high-sounding word. For what purpose? Well, I'll tell you. People have a right to know what's going on and how their money is being spent, or they view it misspent. And when people know these things, in my view, it starts to bring about greater value for the dollar because people are watching. You know what it's like when people are watching. People tend to be on their P's and Q's. And I think we not only get more effective government, but who knows, we might even get more efficient spending. But how does that work? How does that work? How can it? Well, let me give you some illustrations. Nothing like illustrations. And the first one that comes to mind, and it landed in my place when I was wondering what I would talk about tonight, is the cocoa leaf leak. Okay? And I just want to say this about that. We learned today from the World Gazette that owner-operator of Cocoa Reef is now going to have a 120-year lease. That is an incredible lease on any view. I don't care if the chairman of the Board of Governors says to me, February 2008, and probably it sounded like he said, not 1 square meter has been given in freehold. That's sold outright. We retain the ownership of the land. Well, I don't know where he expects to be in 120 years. But I can assure you, most of us will not be here. Not even by the grace of God. So it's practically a lifetime that we're giving away property. And people have to find out about it in the Royal Gazette. I'm going to tell you that's not good enough. And surprisingly, before government doesn't like the Royal Gazette. Find out about it. Because what people are entitled to know are the exact terms of that lease. What are we getting in return in giving something like that for 120 years? And look, this lease, this Cocoa Reef has not been without its history. The auditor did a special report back in April 2004 where he expressed some serious concerns and reservations about the lease that was negotiated back then. There's quite a few pages in here, and I'm not going to go through them all, much as I'd like to. But one of the things he said was, when you put this out for tender, you said it was going to be a 21-year lease. What the person's ended up with is a 50-year lease. This is back in 2003, ladies and gentlemen. And he said he found it incredible that those terms were shifted and the people who were also interested in bidding never got a chance to know, well, do you want to rejig your proposal for 50 years? That didn't happen. Now, I'll take you up to today's date. It was back in February that I was sitting in the House of Assembly next to Grant Gibbons, who's our spokesman for education. And the government tabled, as it has to under the Bermuda College Act, the annual report for the Bermuda College. And I was paying attention to what was going on, but in moments when I could, I was leafing through it. I said, look at this, Grant. Buried here in this paragraph, the chairman's report. They said they've renegotiated the lease at Cocoa Reef. You know anything about that? You heard anything about that? No. I said, well, what's the right and proper thing to do? Let's ask some parliamentary questions. What's the terms of the lease? Was it negotiated? Would you table it, please? Look, that seems to be fair, reasonable, proper action. Nothing over the top about that, is there? Well, what we found out was that government refused to answer the questions. Refused to answer the questions, ladies and gentlemen. And they did so on the grounds that the Bermuda College Act says that the board can enter any lease with the prior approval of the Minister of Education. Well, that doesn't mean you still can't share it with Parliament. And ultimately, it isn't sharing it with John Barritt or Grant Gibbons or the UBP or Parliament. It's the people of the country. That's when you find out what's going extended from 50 years now to 120. We suspected the reason why, though, when we found out about it. I'll come back to that in a minute. I won't stay too long with Go-Go Reef. I got some other illustrations. Well, why isn't government telling us? Why weren't they telling us at that time? Were they ashamed? No. Ought to be. Were they embarrassed? Maybe they ought to be embarrassed too. Or is it because they simply think that people of this country don't care? And I'm going to ask all of you tonight, do you care? Do you care to know? Are you prepared to knock on doors and make telephone calls and do what it takes to pressure your government to do what's right by you? That's what it takes. We do what we have to do. Don't get me wrong, I'm not abdicating responsibility. But the people of this country, I think it's time they started to care. What's my colleague Pat Pamplin says, and I don't want to go over a tangent, she says, when fish rot, they rot from their head. And we've got to make sure our government and our parliament set the right example for everybody, right down the line to the gangs of this country. Okay? There is a right, proper way to do things. You can still disagree. They can still defend what they've done. But people can't make an assessment, can they? Until they know the facts. And if you won't share the facts with me, you leave it to gossip, speculation, and criticism, and you leave yourself open to all manner of speculation as to what's really going on. And let me come to this term. I remember what the Auditor General said when he first looked at this. He said, hang on a minute, you're going to build 66 villas on this property? How can, and they were going to lease it for a long period of time. How can you do that if you've only got a 50-year lease? He was genuinely puzzled. Somebody hadn't thought it through, I guess, or they put the thing through in a hurry. And it was only later somebody started to do the arithmetic and said, well, wait a minute, if we're going to have villas and fractional units down here, we need to have more than 50 years. What will really make it work? And that's why I think you start to see 120 years coming into play. But the people of this country ought to be let in on that, for goodness sakes. Especially when you're giving away an asset like that, which belongs to the people of Bermuda, even though it's in the hands of the Board of Governors of the Bermuda College. It ultimately belongs to the people of this country, and it was put there with good purpose and meaning, and that was to provide a hotel for training of Bermudians. That's what it was put there for. That's forgotten. And then we got the Premier, as Minister of Tourism, starting up another organization to train Bermudians for the hotel industry. It makes you wonder. It makes you wonder what's really going on here. And you're quite right to ask those sorts of questions. You know, here's another thing. I happen to be reading, you know, I save these things. The court never tells me why until later. Renee Webb was the Minister of Tourism at the time, and she stood up in the House and she boldly defended the decision to have given this 50-year lease as opposed to the 21-year that was originally advertised and everything else that went along with it. And she said then, Mr. Speaker, as for the agreement to include the use of the Woodland Reserve, this is to preserve the separation between the college and the hotel, and was added to the lease to ensure security and safety for hotel guests occupying rooms on the northern side of the hotel. Get ready for this one. This land is not intended for Cocoa Reef to develop. That was 6 years ago. And that's what we were told in Parliament with respect to, well, what do we find out the case is today? It's all changed, ladies and gentlemen. And it's changed, and we don't know how dramatically it's changed. We read dribs and drabs in the paper today about the electricity problems and the problem with building and the problem they have with insurance. It doesn't sound right. And you know, forgive me, but I'm just a regular Joe with a cynical mind like everybody else. When I read my Royal Gazette on Monday and I heard Mr. Jeffries complaining about how unfairly he's being criticized. And our beef isn't with him. Our beef is with the government. Don't get me wrong. But when I read how unfairly criticized he felt he was, and on page 1 how he was arguing very strenuously in front of for casino and gambling here, you know, my mind, I